And there were flashes of lightning, and sounds and peals of thunder. And there was a great earthquake, such as there had not been since man came to be upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Revelations 6:18 and 19. How well do you know your shift? Today we're going to talk about 2 types of shifts, seismic and paradigm. A seismic shift is what causes earthquakes. It is a movement of tectonic plates. For the Earth, even the biggest seismic shifts don't do all that much to change the appearance of the continents. According to the theory of continental drift, 150 million years ago there was just one continent, Pangaea. But slowly over time, as the tectonic plates bumped up against one another and shifted, this one continent broke up into our present 7 continents. Seismic shift is slow and imperceptible. In the modern context, a paradigm shift is a change in our way of thinking. It is about humanity seeing itself in a different light. It also happens much faster than a seismic shift. One famous paradigm shift took place during the transition from the classical world to the medieval world, when humanity turned away from philosophers and towards God to solve life's most difficult questions. The paradigm shift we will look at today took place at the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Age of Reason, when humanity stopped looking toward God and looked at scientific investigation to answer life's difficult questions. Our subject for today, the Great Lisbon Earthquake of 1755, explores how seismic and paradigm shifts take place. Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. My name is David Appleson. Today we will examine one of the biggest ground-shaking events in European history, the Great Lisbon Earthquake of 1755. Ground-shaking not just because of the scope and size of the quake, but also for the impression it left on the people of Europe. The Lisbon earthquake not only called into question the nature of God and divine retribution, but also how man responds to changes in nature. As a result of the quake, leading thinkers in Portugal actually examined what went wrong with their response, why so many buildings crumbled, and why so many people died. In order to understand what actually hit the thriving metropolis of Lisbon, Portugal on November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, let's take a look at how earthquakes are caused and how they are measured. According to the United States Geological Service, the Earth is composed of 4 layers: the inner core, the outer core, the mantle, and the crust. The crust and a thin layer of the mantle make up the skin on our planet. But that skin is not one tight surface like that of a balloon. It is more like a jigsaw puzzle with pieces moving slowly against each other and repositioning. We call these puzzle pieces tectonic plates, and they are in a slow, constant state of motion. Where the plates meet are called fault lines. Sometimes, when these plates rub up against each other, they get stuck, and a tremendous amount of energy builds up. When they come unstuck, that energy is released. That is an earthquake. And we humans are just a tiny microcosm on these continent-sized plates. There are 2 ways to measure the severity of an earthquake: intensity and magnitude. Intensity is the observed effect. Are still objects suddenly moving? Are buildings swaying or falling? Can you feel the ground you are on shaking? Intensity is measured on the Mercalli scale, starting at weak and rising up to catastrophic. Magnitude is the amount of seismic energy released at the hypocenter or starting point of an earthquake. It is recorded on an instrument called a seismograph, and it produces that common number we associate with earthquakes, 3.1, 5.4, 8.6, etc. Normally, the hypocenter is located below the Earth's surface, which is why we developed the term epicenter to describe that place on the Earth's surface directly above the hypocenter. Those numbers we associate with earthquakes are from the Richter scale, developed by Charles Richter in 1935. Magnitude does not always equal intensity. A hard surface, like bedrock, will not shake with the intensity of a softer surface like landfill or sand. I witnessed the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake on the bedrock surface of Lone Mountain, where the shaking was minor compared to the mushy surface of Marina Green, where many buildings collapsed, even though the magnitude was the same in both locations. An earthquake of magnitude 8.0 will usually happen somewhere on the Earth at least once a year. If near a population center, these earthquakes can be very destructive. There have been earthquakes over 9.0, but those only happen once every 10 to 50 years. The Indonesian earthquake of 2004 was 9.2 and was one of the strongest earthquakes ever measured, releasing the same energy as a 950 megaton bomb. The Valdivia earthquake in Chile of 1960 holds the measurement record at 9.5. Our Lisbon earthquake, with an epicenter 120 miles to the southwest of Lisbon in the Atlantic Ocean, had an estimated strength of 9.0 on the Richter scale, or very close to the size of the Indonesian quake. But its intensity was near the top of the Mercalli scale, somewhere between 9 and 11, or violent to extreme. The Azores-Gibraltar transform fault is where the African and European plates meet. It shows a complex and active tectonic behavior and is responsible for several large earthquake events that hit Lisbon prior to 1755. 8 earthquakes in the 14th century, 5 in the 16th century, and 3 in the 17th century. During the 18th century, earthquakes were reported in 1724 and 1750. The Phoenicians had recognized the strategic importance of Lisbon when they first established a settlement there around 1000 BC. It sat on the northern shore of the river Tagus, close to the Atlantic, but sheltered from the sea. Following the Phoenicians, the settlement was occupied by the Carthaginians and the Romans. The Visigoths built it into a citadel, and the Moors occupied that citadel. When Portugal declared its independence from the Moors, it made Lisbon its capital in 1255. Portugal, being the nation that initiated the age of exploration and colonization that followed, was one of the first countries to benefit from those overseas conquests. Ports and settlements were established in India, Africa, and Brazil. Exotic goods and precious metals poured into the capital. By the 18th century, Portugal was one of the wealthiest nations in the world. By 1750, the population of Lisbon had swelled to 250,000, and the port was the third biggest in Europe, behind London and Amsterdam. But Portugal's riches were not shared equally. The king took 1/5 of all the gold and diamonds that poured into the nation, and he lavished it on his family, the Catholic Church, and the upper nobility. Most of the Portuguese lived in poverty, and most Lisboans lived in tightly packed quarters built of adobe, brick, or wood. Portugal was a nation that depended on trade and colonization for its revenue. There was practically no industry. Most of the merchants conducting business were from foreign countries, and educational opportunities were so poor, clerks and accountants needed to be brought in from the outside. Its economy was far behind that of the other small seafaring nation of the time, Holland. The empiricism of the Age of Reason, which was burgeoning throughout northern and western Europe, bypassed Portugal, where the church tightly controlled culture and thought. Many considered Lisbon the most pious city in Europe outside of the Vatican. More than 10% of the residents were members of the clergy. But the Inquisition also persisted in Portugal as it did in Spain. Show trials and torture were common for anyone not deemed sufficiently observant, or those considered heretics, dissenters, or humanists, as well as former Jews and Muslims who may have lapsed from their conversions. At that time, All Saints' Day was a major religious holiday for observant Roman Catholics. On the morning of November 1st, 1755, bells beckoned the populace of Lisbon to its many churches. The cramped streets teemed with people, while all commercial activity was shut down. Churches in every parish filled from wall to wall with congregants, and none was more tightly packed than the Basilica of St. Vincent, the city's patron saint. The wealthy and powerful figures of Lisbon sat in the front rows, adorned in velvet, silk, and pricey powdered wigs. Further back were the lesser nobles, the merchant class, and the artisans. Standing in the rear were the poor, dressed in dirty rags. At 9:30 a.m., shortly after the priests and the choir began their Latin chant of the opening incantation, those within the St. Vincent Basilica noticed something unusual. The entire church started to sway and jostle as though it were a ship at sea. The enormous bronze bells in the two towers clanged and clattered. The candelabra and other liturgical candles jerked and toppled, crashing to the floor. The stained glass windows shattered, raining down sharp shards on the crowds below, and the statues of ancient saints were knocked off their pedestals. Then the whole church seemed to be wrenched apart. The timbers supporting the roof twisted and split as the marble columns cracked, pelting people with masonry and wood. Many in the church rushed for the exits to find open ground, while others refused to budge, frantically praying and begging for absolution. For some, it felt like the beginning of the apocalypse. Outside, the bright morning light gave way to an enveloping darkness of dust and debris. Blocks of houses were reduced to piles of rubble. It was a disorienting prospect for Lisboans. They had entered the churches that morning in a city they had known all their lives and stumbled out of the wreckage to a scene of total destruction in a completely unrecognizable environment. Some of the streets were swallowed by fissures as wide as 15 feet. Others were piled high with debris and broken masonry. And everywhere could be heard the screams and yelps of injured animals and people. The first jolt lasted anywhere from 3 to 6 minutes. If you've ever been in an earthquake, you know that 3 minutes feels like an eternity. But 6 minutes of non-stop quaking would be unimaginable torture. Several minutes later there was a second quake. This one was more intense, but shorter in duration than the first. Many of the stronger edifices that survived the first jolt came tumbling down in the second. Stone and marble palaces, churches, and government buildings turned to smoldering mounds of rock. For the survivors, what was disorienting before must have seemed hopeless now. The air was so thick with dust, breathing would have been difficult. Visibility was greatly reduced. The piles of rubble reached several stories high. Those not trapped beneath collapsed buildings still found their escape routes cut off. One English witness described it this way. There was a high arched passage, like one of our city gates, fronting the west door of the ancient cathedral. On the left was the famous church of St. Anthony, and on the right some private houses, several stories high. At the first arch, numbers of people who were then passing under the arch fled into the center of the area. Those in the two churches, as many as possibly could, did the same. At this instant, the arched gateway, with the fronts of the two churches and the two contiguous buildings, all inclining one towards the other with the violence of the shock, fell down and buried every soul, as they were standing there crowded together. Thomas Chase, a British merchant living in Lisbon at the time, said, "Every stone in the walls, separating each from the other, and grinding, as did all the walls of the other houses, one against another, with a variety of different motion, made the most dreadful jumbling noise ears ever heard." By now it must have seemed to the people of Lisbon that the Lord had dealt them a final and unequivocal blow. But God was far from done with them. Only a few minutes after the second quake, there was a third jolt. This jolt was the final blow for many of the trapped, injured, and dying. The city was leveled. In less than 15 minutes, the series of quakes destroyed what took centuries to build. As Lisboans looked around, they could see the king's palace was in ruins. The customs exchange and the opera house were destroyed, and to the bafflement of many of the devout, the Palacios dos Estas, the headquarters of the Inquisition, was flattened. Most of the city's churches were damaged beyond repair. The hovels where the poor lived were little more than dust. If this story were fiction, you might be screaming, "Enough already!" But this is the real world, and the full extent of this disaster still had a ways to go. Similar to the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, small fires were forming all over the city. The many candles used in the churches had toppled and spilled, and the thousands of hearths that residents used to heat their homes were knocked out of place and igniting anything flammable. As the dust settled and sunlight returned, Lisboans could see flames spreading throughout their city. Early morning breezes gave way to violent gusts, spreading flames throughout the wreckage of the town. Rescuing the trapped and injured was no longer a priority. Survivors fled the fire by running to the waterfront, hoping to find a ship that would give them passage across the river Tagus to safer ground. There is chaos in the quays as residents fought and pushed to board any vessel in the harbor. Priests moved through the crowd, demanding that people repent. Misericordia mil Deos. May God show mercy on our souls. But that was not about to happen. As one local merchant reported, "On a sudden, I heard a general outcry. The sea is coming in. We shall all be lost." Upon this, turning my eyes toward the river, which in that place is near 4 miles broad, I could perceive it heaving and swelling in a most unaccountable manner, as no wind was stirring. In an instant there appeared at some small distance a vast body of water, rising as it were like a mountain. It came on, foaming and roaming, and rushed toward the shore with such impetuosity that though we all immediately ran for our lives as fast as possible, many were swept away. As you may recall from the Indonesian earthquake of 2004, the biggest problem wasn't the shaking of the earth in the initial jolt, but the tsunami that shortly followed. And this tsunami would be just as devastating. Coastlines throughout the Atlantic and beyond would be affected by the waves, from Finland to North Africa to Greenland and the islands of the Caribbean. People would be impacted by the tsunami. Waves as high as 60 feet struck the coast of Morocco. A 10-foot-high wave hit Cornwall in South England, and a wave that struck Galway, Ireland, took out a city wall. Thousands were killed by these enormous waves, including those who felt lucky to find a place on a ship, and those still waiting to board on the quay. All but the strongest ships were dashed to pieces, as well as most of the harbor front, the warehouses, and the shipyards. Bloated bodies and pieces of ship wreckage would float in the river for days. The initial wave was followed by 2 lesser waves. Survivors of the first wave would need to dodge the bodies and debris in the water during the second and third waves. Casualties were difficult to determine given the wide scale of destruction. Today it is thought that 30,000 to 40,000 of Lisbon's residents were killed in the series of calamities, and another 10,000 to 20,000 people were killed in other parts of Portugal and the rest of the world. More than 85% of the city was destroyed in the disaster. The 70,000-volume Royal Library was entirely devastated, and classic paintings by Titian, Rubens, and Corrego were lost. The Royal Hospital of All Saints, the world's largest public hospital at the time, was consumed by fire, and hundreds of its patients burned to death. At this time of tremendous desperation and confusion, the people of Lisbon needed a hero, someone who could pull them together in this hour of tragedy, lead the response to rescue the injured and trapped, and rebuild the city to its former glory. Unfortunately for the beleaguered people of Lisbon, it would not be their king. Joseph I and the rest of the royal family escaped the horrors of the catastrophe completely unscathed. That morning the royal family attended early sunrise services. Following Mass, and at the urging of the royal princesses, the family and all of their entourage packed up their gilded carriages and headed to the royal retreat of Belém, 4 miles west of Lisbon. they were seen off by wildly enthusiastic crowds. The royal servants had barely set down the picnic linens and silver samovars when the first of the quakes hit. As the shaking began, there was much scrambling around, with nobles bumping up against commoners and a mad dash to find open ground. But following the third jolt, all were relieved to find the entire party had survived the quake without a scratch. As he watched his great city go up in flames, the king took action. He ordered the immediate erection of tents to house the royal family far away from what remained of the royal palace. Damned if he would be caught dead near a wall after all he had witnessed. And he remained in his tent, inconsolable and paralyzed with fear. "Wherefore hath the Lord done thus unto this great city?" said the king. Had God forsaken him? An hour after the quake, the royal entourage watched the waves of the tsunami crash against the shores of Belém. Messengers arrived throughout the day with explicit details of the unraveling disaster, the destruction of the city, the collapsing of her churches and imperial structures, the screams of pain from the injured, and the vast scope of the fatalities. Some of his advisers suggested moving the capital further inland. Others suggested a location a bit further away, such as Rio de Janeiro. After all, the city was lost. The king shook with despair on his throne. It was at that moment that one of the king's more able ministers arrived, the Secretary of State, Sebastião José de Carvalho Emelio, later known as the Marquês de Pombal. The king's most respected adviser was immediately brought to his majesty, who desired to hear his advice. "What is to be done to meet this infliction of divine justice?" pleaded the king. "We bury the dead and help the living," Carvalho said. "Wait, didn't you just hear what I said about divine retribution? Why so serious?" It would be the pragmatic Carvalho, and not the superstitious king, who would save the day. Joseph I vested Carvalho with almost absolute powers over the state of affairs of his country. Carvalho immediately climbed into his carriage and headed back into the heart of the city. It would be the pragmatic Carvalho, and not the superstitious king, who would save the day. Joseph I vested Carvalho with almost absolute powers over the state of affairs of his country. Carvalho immediately climbed into his carriage and headed back into the heart of the city. He came from the lower gentry in a society where bloodlines meant everything. Carvalho's father served in the royal cavalry. His family preferred to rub elbows with the local intellectual class rather than other nobles. He received no formal education, but through marriage he attained a position in government. As trade ambassador to Britain, he notched several favorable trade agreements and acquired a certain urbane London polish. He was on friendly terms with Portuguese Jewish intellectuals and merchants, and well read on Hobbes, Locke, and Newton. Through a second marriage, following the death of his first wife, Carvalho gained access to the Queen. Due to this influence, as well as immense talents as a diplomat, his forward-thinking ideas regarding social, economic, and political reforms, Carvalho was appointed Secretary of State. Now he faced one of the greatest challenges imaginable. When Carvalho returned to Lisbon, he was confronted by the sight of an entire city in flames. Winds were fanning the many small fires into one huge conflagration. A mass exodus had begun. Survivors, some half-naked and caked with blood and dust, were running around frantically looking for a safe route to the countryside. The disaster showed no favoritism towards rank or title. The urban poor, the nobility, and high clergy were all in a state of panicked confusion. Soldiers abandoned their posts. Priests refused to attend to the injured or dying. Smaller tremors continued after the three major quakes, and the citizens were terrified that the gunpowder magazine at Castel de São Jorge would catch fire and explode, destroying whatever was left of damaged Lisbon. Looting was also a problem as escaped convicts, slaves, and street hoodlums took advantage of the circumstances. With no organized fire brigade available, Carvalho's first action was to re-establish order. He instructed the commander-in-chief of the royal garrison to mobilize his troops, then to assign soldiers to fight the fires, rescue the buried survivors, and to protect all of the churches and royal possessions from looters. Reinforcements were brought in from other parts of the country. One of Carvalho's first decrees was for summary execution of looters. Gallows were erected in all of the prominent plazas, and the bodies were left to hang for a number of days. Looting was brought to an abrupt end. Carvalho's next move was to order the soldiers to round up any able-bodied men attempting to flee the city. He would use this involuntary army to bury the many dead, clear passageways through blocked streets, and build shelters for the multitudes of homeless. He then set up food distribution centers and manned these with armed guards to maintain order when feeding the hungry. Shopkeepers were ordered to charge pre-quake prices or risk being pressed into chain gang service. The tremendous number of dead raised another serious risk: plague. Many of the corpses and those trapped under debris were consumed by the flames, but there was still a huge number that required a proper Christian burial in the ground. Upon Carvalho's request, the local patriarch granted a dispensation for burial at sea. He begged the patriarch to put an end to some of the apocalyptic preaching being conducted by a few of the local clergy, and was contributing to the mass exodus. But Carvalho was rebuffed on this matter. Carvalho and Portugal did receive assistance from an unlikely source: other nations. Financial aid arrived from Great Britain, France, Spain, and the German states. It may have been the first outpouring of international aid following a natural disaster. Many of the donor nations had financial, political, or military ties to Portugal, but it may also have been a sign that the bitterness of the religious wars was subsiding and the ties between European nations were growing stronger. A little more than a month after the big quakes, with Lisbon still being hit by aftershocks and the populace still burying its dead, the chief engineer to the realm, Manuel de Mea, presented his plans for rebuilding the city. Mea's plan, first reviewed by Carvalho before he made his recommendation to the king, consisted of 5 options. The first was to rebuild Lisbon much as it had been prior to the quake, with its narrow, crooked streets and tall buildings, using material taken from the ruins. This was the least expensive of the options. Options 2 and 3 differed from the first by widening certain streets and placing height restrictions on new buildings. Option 4 was much bolder. It called for the complete razing of the central Baixo district, using the rubble to create a strong foundation, laying out new, wider, and straighter streets, and strictly limiting the width and heights of buildings. The plan included modern sewer systems, elaborate drainage systems, and liberal use of space for pedestrians and carriages. Option 5 was Maya's personal favorite. It called for completely abandoning Lisbon and building a new capital just outside of Belém. It would have included all of the best features of Option 4, with the added benefit of starting anew. Option 5 was a non-starter for Carvalho. He saw in it Portugal's economic ruin, the tarnishing of the prestige of the royal family, and most importantly, the eradication of all of his hard work to save the city. Option 4 it would be. The new city layout was influenced by previous city plans, most notably Christopher Wren's aborted plan to rebuild London following the fire of 1666. The new plan would include principles of harmony, symmetry, and proportion. There would be broad avenues, perpendicular streets, symmetrical blocks of buildings, and large public squares. Streets would be 60 feet wide with 10 feet devoted to sidewalks. But perhaps the greatest innovation would be the design of new buildings. Mayo wanted to avoid building over old Lisbon because he feared a future earthquake. But now he was forced to make do with the traditional site of Lisbon. He turned to his best engineer, Eugenio dos Santos, to come up with a plan for constructing earthquake-resistant buildings. Santos did this by replacing the traditional stone foundation with one consisting of wooden piles driven into the ground and topped with pine trunks. Buildings would shake but not crumble in earthquakes. Santo's second innovation was the gaiola, or cage. The gaiola was a lattice-work frame built of wood and composed of triangle shapes, sitting inside rectangle shapes, and placed between the masonry walls of the building. Scale models were constructed, and soldiers marched around the models to simulate earthquakes. To save money, the buildings were prefabricated. That is, they were constructed piece by piece outside of the city and then hauled into the city and assembled into the composite structure. All of these innovations came to be called the Pomboline style of architecture, named after Carvalho, the Marquês de Pombal. The new Lisbon had wide open spaces, expansive boulevards, an abundance of sunlight, and good ventilation. But the far-reaching effects of the Lisbon earthquake went beyond just architecture and civic planning. The quake happened during the Age of Enlightenment, a time when old ideas and values were being questioned and new ones were being explored. Shock waves from the quake were felt throughout Europe, as far away as Finland, Ireland, Italy, and Switzerland. With advances in printing, graphics, and travel, news and information was spreading and being shared faster than ever before. People throughout Europe were receiving first-hand accounts and engravings depicting the events within days of feeling the tremors in their own nations. Many people had the same question: why Lisbon? If natural disasters were always a sign of divine retribution, why did God choose pious Lisbon to incur his wrath? Wealthy and less religious London and Paris are right over there. And hey, what about Amsterdam? It's the secular capital of Europe. As Goethe later said, God, the creator and upholder of heaven and earth, whom the explanation of the first article of the Creed declared to be so wise and merciful, in so far as he had abandoned the just and unjust to a like destruction, had in no way shown himself to be fatherly. One of the most strident voices on this matter was that of Voltaire. The philosopher, poet, and playwright penned a poem the month after the earthquake that attacked the optimistic reasoning of earlier philosophers Gottfried Leibniz and Alexander Pope, that God was just and kind and that all actions happened for a divine purpose. Voltaire countered these thoughts with rationalism and pessimism. He engaged with his fellow French philosopher Rousseau, who brought to his attention the point that maybe the scope of the death and suffering had nothing to do with God's actions, but was the result of poor human planning. Rousseau's response must have had a great influence on Voltaire. In 1759, 4 years after the quake, he published his masterpiece, Candide, a paean to pragmatism. The protagonist of the novel suffers numerous deprivations, including being pinned under falling debris during the Lisbon earthquake, then being sent to burn at the stake for heresy by Portuguese church authorities to satiate God's desire for justice. Candide responds to Leibniz's assertion that if we live in the best of all possible worlds by asking, so what are the other worlds like? In 1756, perhaps influenced by Rousseau, Immanuel Kant published 3 tracts on earthquakes, explaining them as scientific rather than a supernatural phenomenon. Kant speculated that earthquakes were caused by the shifting of huge caverns of hot gases. Although his theory was later proved incorrect, it was an early example of using scientific rationale to explain what was previously believed to be supernatural causes. But perhaps no one did more to change our way of thinking than Carvalho himself. From his beginnings, he was naturally opposed to the clergy and nobility. The earthquake presented him with the opportunity to deal a crushing blow to the aristocracy and the church and bring his nation into the modern age. In 1756, he distributed to all of the local dioceses what came to be called the Pombal Survey. In the survey, he asked 13 questions, including, at what time did the quake begin, and how long did it last? What was the direction of the shaking? Did you notice any unusual phenomenon prior to the quake? And what immediate measures did you notice taken by the army, the priests, and the ministers? He used scientific inquiry to determine what happened and what steps could have been taken to prevent or mitigate damages in future disasters. And isn't that what the podcast of doom is all about? It makes no sense to ask what could have been done differently prior to or during the All Saints' Day earthquake in Lisbon. Lisbon was no less prepared for a major earthquake than any other great city of the time. And even in the current day, we would be hard-pressed to find a major city that was prepared to deal with a catastrophic earthquake, an enormous sweeping tsunami, and a full-scale fire all on the same day. Although I'm sure Japan is taking the lead on this matter. What we should examine is the response. Carvalho was the right person for the job. He restored order out of panic, convinced those fleeing to return, dealt swiftly with looters and thus with disorder, helped the injured, the hungry, and the homeless, removed the bodies of the dead in a timely manner to prevent the flare-up of disease, demanded that the new Lisbon be built over the old one, and thus kept order in the realm and when the new city was built. The new Lisbon was cleaner, more orderly, less constricting, and more beautiful than what it replaced. It was also much better prepared for a future earthquake than any other city of the time. Carvalho would remain Portugal's de facto ruler with King Joseph's blessing for 27 years. He ended the Inquisition and removed the Church's fanatical grip on the country. He fell from power when the king passed away and spent the last 2 years of his life living in exile on his estate in Pombal. In fact, when Joseph died and his daughter Maria became queen, she may have imposed history's first restraining order when she refused Carvalho to be within 20 miles of her at any time. Today, Carvalho, known by his title Pombal, is recognized as a hero in Lisbon. His statue looks out over the public square that is named after him, and his likeness has a bronze lion at its side symbolizing power. Thank you for joining me for the Podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you and answer any questions that you might have. I would also like to send out a special thanks to listener Antonio Rodriguez, who suggested the topic for this episode. I hope I got everything right, but mostly I hope I pronounced all of the Portuguese names correctly, or at least somewhere close to correctly. Thank you, Antonio. Also, I'd like to thank Chris Munch for donating to the show. Thanks to people like Chris, the Podcast of Doom is able to keep podcasting. Please find us on Facebook under the name The Podcast of Doom. And if we get enough likes, we will unlock the next achievement, which I expect to be even more exciting than a Swiffering cat. In the next episode, we will explore that pesky little virus, Yersinia pestis, that took out a third of Europe and a good chunk of Asia in the 14th century. Until then, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.